Yet another definition of sin was given by the medieval theologian Anselm. Anselm, who died around 1109, argued that sin was not giving God the honor that God is due. Now, Anselm was writing out of a cultural situation where the world was feudalistic. And in feudalism, the serf was required to give his feudal lord a particular amount of honor. And so, using feudalism to explain sin, he argues that just as serfs must honor their lord by giving him what is due, so humans must give God the honor that's due to him. Or to quote Anselm, he says, "What is the debt which we owe God? This is righteousness or uprightness of the will. This is the sole honor, the complete honor which we owe to God and which God demands from us. Someone who does not render to God this honor due to him is taking away from God what is his and dishonoring God. And this is what it is to sin," according to Anselm. Yet another definition is that sin involves displacing God. Every sin is, in effect, a violation of the first of the 10 Commandments, "You shall have no other gods before me." Sin involves not giving God his proper place as Lord by obeying his commands or by putting something or someone else ahead of God. To put anything in the place that God deserves is idolatry. Yet another definition of sin is that sin involves sensuality or desires. James 1, verses 14 and 15, "But every person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin." Again in James chapter 4 and verse 1, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you?" And 1 John 2:16, "For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world." Now, unlike Buddhism that says that desires or craving to hold on to pleasurable experiences is the source of suffering and therefore should be extinguished, Christianity does not say this. It does not condemn desires per se. But it does say that desires can lead us in our attempt to satisfy our desires can lead us into sin. Let's take that verse in 1 John 2:16 again that talks about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. The lust of the flesh, while there's nothing wrong with the desire to enjoy things, the desire to enjoy things can lead us into sin. And this may be alluding back to the Garden of Eden, where the serpent tempted Eve by showing her that the forbidden fruit was good for food, Genesis 3 and verse 6. The devil tempted Jesus to perform a pointless miracle to satisfy his need for food when he tells him, "Turn these stones into bread." Our natural desire for sensual pleasure can lead people to violate God's moral law. The desire for food might lead to gluttony or to theft. The desire for sex can lead to sexual immorality. Though desire for food is not inherently evil, and even desire for sex is not inherently evil, but if it leads to violation of God's law, then it becomes evil. 1 John 2:16 also speaks of the lust of the eyes. Again, there's nothing wrong with wanting pretty things. In the book of Proverbs, the ideal woman has some luxury items. It says that she is clothed in scarlet, Proverbs 31 and verse 21. The book of Proverbs says material things can be a blessing from God, Proverbs 10 and verse 22. And yet desire for nice things can lead us to sin. Eve was tempted because the forbidden fruit was pleasing to the eyes. Again, I think 1 John 2:16 may be meditating on the narrative about the fall of Adam and Eve. The forbidden fruit was pleasing to the eyes. The devil tempted Christ with the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And so the desire to obtain nice things can lead to envy, to greed, to Ponzi schemes, to theft, and many other specific sins. And then there's the boastful pride of life that's mentioned in 1 John 2:16. The desire for respect and achievement, the pride of life, is, again, not sinful per se. So, for example, in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. It's not wrong to aspire to leadership positions in the church. But pride often is a source of sin. Some Christians say that pride is the root of all sin. Adam and Eve, out of pride, wanted to be like God, not needing God. It could be translated like gods, Genesis 3, verses 5 and 6. Arrogance leads to seeks achievement or status at the expense of others and can make people think that they can get away with violating moral norms. Let me give you some other observations about sin. Sin is opportunistic. Sometimes we do not yield to sin not so much because we're good, but because we have no opportunity or have not been tested fully. Adam in Eden could not be tempted with adultery since there were no other women in the garden except for Eve. A bank teller can be tempted to pilfer money from it, but someone not working for the bank is not tempted to do that particular sin. A person may resist temptation the first time he or she is tempted, but eventually yield to the temptation to sin when tempted repeatedly or more intensely. And so sin takes advantage of our circumstances. Sin can also be structural in society. There can be unjust laws. For example, Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 1 says, "Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression." You can have the decrees or the laws themselves be unjust in the way that they were written, and therefore create a structural injustice in society. One can think of the Jim Crow laws in the Old South and the apartheid laws in South Africa that were inherently unjust by persecuting colored people or black people just for being the color of skin that they happen to have. There's laws in communist countries or Muslim countries that either abolish Christianity or oppress Christians, and those are also inherently unjust. And unjust laws encourage law-abiding citizens to act sinfully and even punish people for doing what is, in God's sight, what is right. Some laws are passed just to enrich the friends and cronies of the political leaders. The people passing such laws are the ones morally responsible, but their laws may continue to do harm long after the ones responsible for passing them are gone. While we're on the topic of sin, perhaps you've heard of the concept of the 7 deadly sins. In the 14th century, at the end of the Middle Ages, priests and artists often refer to the 7 deadly sins. The 7 deadly sins teach about moral theology or Christian ethics, and these 7 sins are pride, covetousness, anger, sloth, envy, gluttony, and lust. The earliest list of these is found in Gregory the Great, who became Pope in 590. These sins are not so much different than other sins, but other sins arguably come out of them. Thus, pride can lead to rebellion, covetousness can lead to theft, anger can lead to murder, sloth can lead to neglect of duty, envy can lead us to mistreat the people we envy. Gluttony can lead to wasting essential funds on unnecessary luxuries. Lust can lead to adultery, and so on and so forth. Now, the 7 deadly sins have their opposites, which you might call 7 virtues. So the opposite of pride would be humility. The opposite of covetousness is charity. So rather than being selfish with what you have, sharing. The opposite of anger would be patience. So rather than showing anger, we're patient with people. Sloth, the opposite of that is diligence. The opposite of envy is kindness. The opposite of gluttony would be temperance. And the opposite of lust would be chastity. And so it's a part of moral theology to encourage us to avoid sins like pride and covetousness and anger and sloth and envy and gluttony and lust, but to affirm virtues like humility, charity, patience, diligence, kindness, temperance, and chastity. More on sin in the next lecture.